Hey
Hello.
there. Good morning.
Good
This is
morning.
me trying to sit down.
Yeah, you turned us on and then you stood up.
Yeah, hey,
Way to stand up for everyone's rights.
hey,
Anyway,
don't laugh. We're doing an event tomorrow called Stand Up or Step Down. It's for our congressman. We're going out
I
there.
like it.
It's like, guys, you don't you don't sit there and remain silent in the face of such grievous assaults upon America and the institutions that we have, and then think that you're doing our work. So basically, it's do your job. And so it's going to be an interesting day tomorrow. But today is even more interesting. Today we have got Cliff is bringing us his guests, and I'm going to do everybody in the audience a great service by saying, "Welcome aboard, guys. It was a wonderful time chatting with you guys before the show, but now it's Cliff time. Clifford."
Good morning, everyone.
Good
So,
morning.
roughly 2 years ago, a little under 2 years ago, in Pride Month in June in 2023, I did a special with the wonderful writers Deborah J. Ross and Lyda Morehouse on LGBTQ plus in SFF, and not in horror because that's its own topic. It's so huge when it comes to queer content, especially. But we covered science fiction and fantasy, and it was meant to be the first of a series of explorations into this sort of territory, and this is the second. I have two wonderful writers here, and first I have Ciiff Schwartz, who writes under Steven, and they have written some wonderful pieces, including one I'm still very fond of called Leash Steel, which is gay. Always causes Steph to laugh when I say that. Gay BDSM space opera, which was a story that I would love to see expanded into a novel. I'm just very hopeful someday. And then and other wonderful things. And then Kate Johnston, who is a writer and editor, and her latest project is a dinosaur anthology that is forthcoming real soon now, I understand, and I'm sure she'll tell us about that. But first, we will talk about we're going to talk about queer representation, LGBTQ representation in science fiction and fantasy over time, including coded representation. And we're going to define what that means for those who don't know what coded is. But there were periods of the 20th century where there were all sorts of codes. There was the Hollywood Code, there was the comic book code, there were unofficial codes in publishing. The Hays Code. Bob just mentioned in the comments, and you couldn't talk openly about LGBTQ characters, and you couldn't have them openly. And so we're going to talk about how that has affected things. And I'll tell you one story. My very first exposure to a coded gay character, I didn't know was a coded gay character. I was a little kid watching Lost in Space reruns. And in the mid 60s, when Lost in Space started, all on his own, the actor Jonathan Harris decided Dr. Smith, he was going to play Dr. Smith gay. And how did he do that? Well, he incorporated every terrible gay stereotype into his character portrayal. This was like 1965, so he had a lot of them that he could use, and he used them all. And as a kid, I just read him as like a cartoonishly cowardly character, which wasn't hard for me because I was used to watching cartoons. So, he just fit right in with the cartoons, only he was live action. So that was the first one that I encountered that was coded. So my wonderful panelists, if you would like to talk about coded queer characters and how you first, whether you found them in literature or media or whatever, and talk about that. Anyone want to go first? Distinguished panel of experts. Steph.
I'll go first. The first one that I encountered, admittedly, was from a non-US source, which changes the coding somewhat.
Okay, talk about that.
Well, one version of him had magnificently ruffled sleeves and a ruffled front coat that no one in that day and age would even dare wear out on Carnaby Street to be taken seriously.
Are we talking about the Third Doctor?
And the fourth Doctor, all of the doctors who carefully treated their female companions with the utmost gentility and asexual affection.
No kissing on the TARDIS, as it was said back then.
No kissing on the TARDIS.
Although there was the idea of the dandy, right?
Yes, but the Third Doctor would have been a dandy even in the dandy era.
Sure. And the most famous dandy is, of course, Oscar Wilde. So
right. the point being that this was a character who was queer coded in part because they weren't traditionally masculine coded. They were sufficiently other coded as to fit into some queer category, whether that be gay or alien or what have you. But there were so many, you had the Brigadier, you had a collection of manly or boyish companions, etc., all around. You had all the traditional masculine figures, and then there was the Doctor who didn't fit any of them.
Fair.
And so it was coded very much as other, which at that age, especially for me, read queer.
May I ask what age you were watching those?
Yeah, I was watching Doctor Who, and that actually got coded to me just as British because I didn't know how weird British men were.
Is he queer or is he just British?
And that continued. Like, I had a friend who had a boyfriend that were like, he wears corsets better than you, but I think we're just British. And he's like, yeah, I'm just British. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is, at least in the queer subculture I grew up in, there was the standing game, gay or European.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, remember
really fun game to play.
The 80s and man bags and what did they call that? It was like hetero something. I don't remember, but when
metrosexual.
Metrosexual, yes. It's like when straight men begin to wash their butts, and there we go.
They actually combed their hair before they went out.
Who knew? But actually, the first, and to go on with Cliff's idea of that, like it was always sort of this coded villain stereotype. My first coded character that I understood was Baron Harkonnen.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to get to that, but you run with it. Run with Vladimir Harkonnen.
But that just, I mean, that told me where, like, even, like, okay, people who look like me weren't allowed to be gay, really, except for Michael Jackson, but we can get into that later. But to have this person...
Gay or just metrosexual?
Anyway. To have this person be the, titular leader of their planet, the leader of their thing, and also be this monstrous person, let me know, like, where that opinion lay in the public. And so it didn't surprise me very much that when I got into Pern, when I got into Anne McCaffrey, that those were also coded very weirdly. It was like the first acceptance, but also not kind of quite. So
yeah. So the other delightful thing, of course, about Baron Vladimir Harkonnen is it's fat phobia on top of
Oh yeah.
homophobia, right?
There's actually a bunch of body horror on top of that.
Yeah, like everything mainstream heteronormative middle class America did not like was embodied in that man,
Mhm.
in a lot of ways. Not every way, right? Like his race, he was white, so.
Mhm.
But everything that could happen to a white man that would make that white man no longer acceptable, he embodied,
Yes.
right? Which is quite the fall. And then he was elevated to like basically the second highest position under the emperor. So that's um, so yeah, and he's a confirmed bachelor, right? He has nephews.
Which makes me think about Scrooge McDuck, some things.
Oh yeah, now there's
Yeah.
that I could see. I could see that,
But the
And
other
Donald has
really
bachelors, even though he likes Daisy.
he never wears
His
pants.
nephews. He's a bachelor with nephews, even though he likes Daisy. He never seems to marry Daisy.
No, because he's a smart duck.
And
But there's like the other queer coded
Bugs
fictional person in my life would have been Jesus.
oh, tell me about that, because I did not grow up with Jesus.
Well, he's a guy wandering around in a robe with his 12 male friends. What do you want?
Preaching nonviolence. Let's not.
Yeah, talking about peace and love, and what is that all about? And then and then everybody mistook what Sodom and Gomorrah meant. But yeah, that's definitely a big one. And then I was a missionary when I was like 9.
Really?
And yeah,
you
and
weren't
so
very successful at it then, I assume.
Well, it got me out of the country for the first time.
Oh, where'd you go?
Canada. Yeah, but yeah, no, I toured
heard about
the country.
Jesus, eh?
Heard about Jesus, eh? But there's a whole bunch of stuff that's like super queer coded in there, and nobody really talks about it, and I find it really interesting.
So I think
Go ahead.
I think that part of that is where we are relative to the coding, because a lot of stuff that was queer coded back, whether intentionally or not, I mean, obviously in Harris's case it was for Lost in Space.
Yeah, he said that in interviews.
Was for a bunch of the stuff with the Doctor. But what counts as queer coding now is different than what was queer coded in the 80s, is different than what was queer coded in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's
Talk
one
about
of the
that.
reasons that I love Chip Delaney's story, I and Gomorrah, so much. Because it is fundamentally about the idea of being queer, whatever the society thinks is queer or not. Yeah, it is. And that's, I think, part of the purpose of having everybody go, oh, spoiler alert, but go read the story. It will survive my spoilers. Oh, I could have been attracted to you, but you're different. Whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, whether it was seeing it through a straight eye, a gay eye, it's always just you. Frelk is the other. And it is defined and definitively that other. And there's a clear coding for it within the story. The people in the story recognize that no matter what, even though I don't recall us being able to tell other than that the narrator says so. The people in the story can all tell. They know that you're coded differently. They know you're different.
So has anyone read the Clan of the Cave Bear books by Jean Auel?
Yes.
So that's the first time in literature where I ran into a gender fluid or non-binary character. There's a shaman person who's
Crab?
Cro-Magnon, not a Neanderthal. I think it might be in Valley of the Horses.
Okay.
But there's a shaman who is described as like Ayla can't figure out what their gender is. And their gender is never specified. They're old, they have gray hair. But the interesting thing about that choice, from a literary criticism point of view, is that they are already othered, right? They're a shaman. They're the old weirdo in the clan, and they and Owl doesn't use any pronouns at all. She somehow figures out how to. So there's no they them pronouns. I'm just using those because they're convenient. They are yeah, two-spirit style, as Carol says in the chat. Emphasis on style, because there's a lot of I think 20th century wish fulfillment in the historical fiction of Jane Owl. But anyway, yes, I know, right? Shocking. But it was interesting that it was there, right? Like she put that element in the book, and didn't have to, and it was portrayed as a positive character, one who was a mentor for Ayla. And who conveyed shaman information and was all mystical and woo woo, and you know, but that was a trans coded character, kind of. I don't know how coded. It was pretty obvious that, well, just Ayla was like, she spent a few paragraphs trying to figure out the gender of this person, just gave up. As far as I can remember, it's been a while, but that's my recollection. And that I think Clan of the Cave Bear was the 1970s, but I think Valley of the Horses might have been the early 80s, somewhere roughly in the time frame. So by that point, we have coded queer characters who are not necessarily evil, right? Like I mean, Dr. Smith is the villain of Lost in Space, but he's a bumbling villain, and you know. He sort of becomes, over time, when it becomes the Dr. Smith and Will Robinson show and robot show, he becomes more of a protagonist who has so many character flaws that he keeps getting them into trouble, but he's not evil. Yet he's other, right? He's the one who doesn't belong on the spaceship. He's the only one who doesn't belong. I mean, he's coded as a Soviet agent in the beginning, in the pilot. He's a serious character. He's a Soviet agent. He's there to destroy the spaceship, and it's not specified what nation he's from. Even that's coded, right? He's from that nation that we can't mention. So he's othered in every way possible for, like,
he's a
an older white dude to be othered. What?
He's a Klingon, in other words.
He's a Klingon. Yes, no.
Yep.
Well, we could talk about that. You know, like what's coded queer in Star Trek? I mean, you know,
everything
as everything. Captain.
Well,
Kirk
I mean, if you look at the Next Generation,
very heterosexual. What?
If you look at the Next Generation, the first episode they had guys walking around in skirts, and then they stopped doing it.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah, they had it because they wanted to make it equal in the 24th century.
Like, how are you going to have
coded gay? Even though he has a Spock, Mr. Spock, is he coded gay? Even though he has a fiance.
Kinda.
Are all smart men coded gay in science, early science? No.
Now you know you don't want to ask me that question.
I just asked you that question.
I hope so.
That's
in my life, yes.
Answer to that question.
I mean,
yeah. I mean, Scotty wears a kilt in Star Trek 2 with funeral for Mr. Spock. But anyway,
you're not going to start arguing that merely wearing a kilt makes you coded gay, are you?
You know why you don't call it a skirt, right? Because if you do, you get kilt.
Oh.
Anyway.
Wait. But in 1983, though, we got what was arguably one of the first protagonists that was explicitly coded as bisexual.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to give you an earlier one, but go on. Talk about Heinlein. Jerry Cornelius.
All right, I'll say the nice things I can say about Heinlein. That was a book that I absolutely loved, and I read like every 6 months for about a decade and a half until I outgrew it. But that was the first time where somebody like took hold of her sexuality and said, I'm gonna sprinkle this on whoever I want, which is great. They ran around in between countries, which was awesome, and that like took some time. It was people who had specifically planned for the dissolution of their society in a way that I don't think we have planned for it.
Yet we're living in it.
I know, right? If I had a bolt hole in Canada that had the extra like secret room on the outside, I'd be there now. But that gave me personally, and I'm assuming an entire generation of little girls, like, oh my God, we actually do have permission to go do these sorts of things.
Sure. So about a decade and a half earlier, in the late 60s, Michael Moorcock created his science fiction version of Elric, Jerry Cornelius. And in the novel, The Final Program, there's one paragraph I love. I mentioned this in the last podcast, so I'll make it brief. There's a paragraph-long description of everyone at a party. A self-pitying albino, a bunch of college girls, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And then about 2/3 of the way through this long paragraph, a heterosexual, and then he just keeps going on. So there are explicit scenes like pillow talk that Jerry has with another man. He's gender fluid. He cross-dresses, which at the time was more progressive than it is now. I'm not going to say that aged well, but it's there, right, in the 60s and 70s stories by Michael Moorcock in the Cornelius Chronicles.
I'm going to echo from the chat, Andrew J. Lucas, considering Elric, because I think in terms of coded queer as opposed to explicitly queer, Elric, we know from word of author that Elric was in many ways written to be the antithesis of many of the masculine coding.
Conan. Yeah, he's the anti-Conan.
Right, he's the Nanok, as it were. And so when you write a character to be deliberately anti-masculine coded in a binary society, they end up being queer coded because that's what queer coding is.
It's brilliant.
Away from the unmarked state of masculinity.
That's a brilliant analysis, because when he created Elric, he couldn't have him openly pansexual or bisexual and gender fluid. And now, a few years later, when he creates Jerry Cornelius, he can.
Now, you would know because you've kept up with Elric better than I, but has Elric been bisexual in the later novels outside?
Not that I remember.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean it didn't happen and I've forgotten.
Well, I mean, considering Melnibonean society includes, torturing and eating your enemies, thinking that they might have sex with the same gender is not really a huge stretch.
Yeah. I mean, or as we say in Melnibone, Tuesday.
Right.
Yes. No. But then, even that would be disturbing, because Melnibone is coded as, what do you call it? Decadent and dissolute and everything. So, if you made it openly queer, that would be, not so good.
Desolate and decadent and dissolute is definitely queer coding, but go ahead, Stu.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that Moorcock himself, Elric is that way. That's where Moorcock writes. Jerry Cornelius, The World Ends, I don't know how many times. Elric is at the end of the world. The Coram books are at the end of the world. He wrote an entire series about the end of the universe. You know this, Cliff.
The Dancers at the end. Now, the Dancers at the end of time. There is no heteronormativity at the end of time.
Decadent and dissolute is where Moorcock lives in fiction.
Yeah, but that strangely in real life he moved to Texas. Anyway.
It's dissolute.
Just whatever.
Desiccant for dissolute.
Yeah. Well, at least it was a suburb of Austin. But anyway.
Egyptian. And I'm trying to figure out, when was the Forever War printed or published? That was like early 70s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was in the wake of Vietnam.
And that was definitely very queer. That was not queer coded. That was explicitly people, were having sex with other people of the same gender, and that was okay. In fact, it was not only okay, that was the way people were going in the future. which
Well-
I find really interesting, but I haven't gotten a chance to talk to Joe about it.
It reminds me of a series of short stories that sort of evolve a single concept through time and that read as very transphobic to queer coded by necessity to this isn't queer anymore, it's just the way things are.
Mhm.
The Crime and Glory of Commander Suzdal by Cordwainer Smith,
Mm,
a significant blot upon his record. When It Changed
yes.
Talk about that.
by Joanna Russ, and the reintroduction of men,
Yes.
and the failed reintroduction of men in Houston, Houston, Do You Read by James
Yay.
Tiptree Jr.
Why don't you talk about those two stories? The
Which-
last two.
The last two.
The Russ and the Tiptree.
Yes.
And maybe a little bit about Tiptree's gender.
So it has been a while since I read When It Changed, so I believe I'm getting the details right, but please correct me if I'm screwing up.
I read it more recently again, so
I have to.
When It Changed deals with essentially an all-female society being rediscovered.
a lost colony
Yes.
in which men had died of some disease or something. I forget. But they reproduced by cloning.
Right. And how were the women going to deal with this inevitable fact? The colony had been rediscovered. You cannot put...
The genie back in the bottle.
Thank you. I was trying to get past putting the worms back in the jar. Yes, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. What are we going to do? What does this mean? And it's obviously queer in the sense that it's outside the normal binary, but it relies on that binary having been there and still presents it as a certain amount of the binary is built into us even if we manage to get around it.
Right. This is not an if men, it's a fait accompli.
Right. It's men, therefore. And in Houston, Houston, Do You Read? An accident in space transports a group of men, space crew, into a female-only society inhabiting the Earth in the future. And the decision made by the women inhabiting the future is, no. We don't need you anymore. Bye.
Yeah, it's the very, go to sleep. You'll wake up in the farm upstate where you can run and play.
You have a much brighter memory of it than... yes, you'll wake up in the farm somewhere upstate. Just go to sleep, and when you wake up, it will all be better.
Mm-hmm.
Is the farm upstate like the cornfield in that story?
Not Anakin, yes. It's the... When you wake up is the incorrect way of putting it.
Yeah. But I loved how I mean, obviously they put this in the mouth of one of the guys. That's who the protagonist is. So you're seeing him not understanding what he's seeing. Not understanding how this society works, and not just because it's new to him, but because he's unable to think about it. He's actually not him, but other members of his crew are literally unable to have the concept that women can live without them.
Yeah, the protagonist is by far and away the most feminist of the male characters, and it's still nowhere near enough.
No, and the women actually see this as Cersei's as a kindness. Because where would they fit? They are going to be basically mentally ill for the rest of their lives, and they will not.
Is a mighty drug.
Well, yeah. So yeah, and obviously, as you requested, James Tiptree Jr. was a woman, signed female at birth. Yeah. And also writing under Raccoona Sheldon, if it tells you anything. And she eventually was involved in a murder-suicide, I think.
Yes.
But that's a whole other set of medical issues that don't have to necessarily do with the queer coding. But
Right.
Tiptree in her lifetime dealt with such a huge number of subjects in ways that I just don't even think we've really touched real hard. The one about like where they send the whole ambulance of babies off to die, like that's a whole, go find the short stories and read them because they will hurt you in the
Love
good
is the
way.
plan. The plan is death.
Yeah, that's also
Where you have an alien species on a kind of downward spiral from sentience, and this one explicitly male member of the species who's like multiple times bigger than the females is in love with this female and wants to preserve things and not do the normal like die and do the next generation thing, and is fighting against that, a losing battle, you know, and but the struggle is all from his point of view.
Another example of coding from Tiptree's work, or making the coding explicit. And I awoke and found me here on the cold hill's side, which is a story all about the sexual attraction of the alien, in which our naive reporter meets someone who works at a space station, who works there because they might get a chance to interact with an alien and how sexually and otherwise attractive they are, even if they are utterly mutually physically incompatible. And that's coming back to that, it's coding as something inescapably other.
Sure.
And when I first read that, I thought about the people I knew, because at the time I did know people who were queer, closeted, and working in jobs that had them around a lot of the objects of their desire that they could never approach because the objects of their desire were straight as boards. And so in this way,
well, you and I both worked in the Midwest, so yeah.
Exactly. You know, so they were torturing themselves to a certain extent in exactly the way this character was, because they couldn't bear to be away from the object of their desire, but they knew the object of their desire, or they knew the object of their desire was unattainable.
Sure.
Yeah. That's
I had a couple college roommates, and one of them went into an industry where he needed to get a security clearance, and so he informed the other two of us who were his college roommates that we would get a phone call from, you know, some vetter from the federal government. And so I did indeed get a phone call, and, you know, said like, no, he's not a communist. No, he's not, you know, whatever. No, he's not gay. Right. Because this was the late 1980s. And that was the thinking at the time, was that if you're gay, you must be closeted. And that is somewhere a path of blackmail. So we can't hire anyone gay, you know. And it was so frustrating because I really wanted to tell the guy off, but I also wanted my roommate to get the job, so I couldn't do that. So I answered his questions. No, he's not gay, blah, 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 blah. And then went off and like complained to my friends about how annoying that conversation had been. And he got the job. So, you know, yay.
Yeah, I'd be willing to say that we're going to see that coming back.
Yeah. So that brings us up to let's do a little fast forward and talk about 2025 and recent years, both the first Trump presidency and the Biden presidency and the Obama presidency. Queer fiction in the science fiction, fantasy, and horror genre has ballooned, right? Marketing is like, the marketing for books is queer, right? The word queer is used to market books all the time in our genre. The the message, the subliminal message we get from publishing is that every reader wants to read queer stories, which is probably not true. But even beyond that is interestingly explicit compared to the world we grew up in, right? Where like you couldn't put that on a book cover because you wouldn't sell any books, especially in a male protagonist, which is one of the things that makes the explicit queerness of Jerry Cornelius so interesting, is that bisexual women are a lot more, or gay women are a lot more acceptable in stories, movies, fictions, television than gay men and bisexual men, because of the notion that to be gay is somehow unmasculine. But it used to be lesbian was somehow unfeminine, right? But that seems to have dropped off first from the stereotypes historically.
It depends. I mean, we're still not allowed to be two things.
Yeah, well,
you can't be queer
like
and
lesbian and bisexual is attractive to straight men, so it's more acceptable.
Well, right. That, and also you can't, like, when you, it's especially within the publishing world, queer is great. Black is still not. So, yes, it's okay to be all of these things as long as you're still the dominant race. But once we get into that, it's like, well, why do they have to be? And so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of self-censoring that goes on, and then there's a lot of publishing censoring that goes on.
Yeah, you make it through you write it, but then you have to make it through the filters, right? Like it used to be the case in publishing, like, oh, you could have this gay character, but they have to die horribly.
Yes.
Right? Or something bad has to happen to them that doesn't involve death.
Yes. Do you remember which film was the first one that the woman both won and got the girl?
No. Tell me.
Bound.
I love that film.
I know, but see how late it was?
Yeah.
Yeah, when was that? The 1990s, I want to say?
Think so.
Yeah. And that's such a brutal film. I mean, it's so, and it's intense, right, in so many ways. And what's delightful about it is the villain is super smart, but it takes him a very long time to get past the blind spot of, oh, wait, what? You're a couple? I'm like, is that even possible? But then once he does, he accepts it and continues to be brilliant in his analysis and trying to get out of this trap that they set for him, which makes him a
right. And go for it, Steph.
Well, this is sort of going sideways from this, but I was noting again in the comments from Andrew Lucas and thinking about you can't be X and Y. Thinking about the number of characters, like, to invoke Heinlein again, Johnny Rico, whose race is not revealed except barely, something like 2/3 of the way through the book. And even then, it's only revealed if you know what Heinlein is talking about.
Coded race.
Right. But the experience, part of the experience in coding is, I'm sure there are many, many people, and we probably demonstrated it in this discussion, who know deep down in their hearts that character X is queer, whether or not author Y wrote them to be that way, because we just know, and we were that desperate for actual representation.
Let's talk about fan fiction for a minute, right? Because, like Slash started as Kirk/Spock, right? Yep. Which is an explicit sexualizing of an asexual relationship on the show, a platonic relationship on the show. And there are millions and millions of words, billions and billions of words being written where they are shipping characters who are not, or the same gender on the show or whatever, but are not explicitly in any kind of romantic relationship. And this is a big thing. Like, a lot of writers are writing this and a lot of readers are reading this. And it's a big chunk of fan fiction. Not all, by all means, but it's a thread in fan fiction. It's a significant, noteworthy thread. And that this had to thrive in the fan fiction world because readers wanted it, but and publishing wasn't delivering it, right?
Yeah.
And shows weren't delivering it. I brought my coffee mug is Babylon 5 from the early to mid 90s, one of the first shows to not only be explicit about LGBTQ, but nonchalant about it. Now it had to have it sort of subtle to be on television at that time. But Ivanova is bisexual. She has a romantic relationship with Talia Winters, and she has another, well, almost has one with Marcus, right? And but she's explicit about, and the closest we get to seeing that on camera is there is a coded scene where Ivanova and Winters are together, and one of them has spent the night, but it is not explicit; it's coded. Right? You have to know that they're in a relationship to even, oh, wait, what?
Yep.
And then at the end, after what happens to Talia, I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen the show, happens to Talia, Ivanova confesses to Delenn, I think I loved Talia Winters, right? And, she's not talking like platonic. And then there's a wonderful bit in the 5th season where the Abbott and Costello of the show, Marcus and the doctor, and the two of them are undercover going to Mars, and their cover story is that they're a married couple, and they're two men, and that's all, and they make a lot of jokes about it, but the jokes are not gay jokes. The jokes are married couple jokes. Right, where like he's like, yes, dear, just like doing it like they're a married couple, and they play it, if you'll pardon the expression, straight, right? They don't treat the explicit gay cover relationship as anything other than a marriage, right? It was a delightfully nonchalant way, and this was before same-sex gay marriage was even like a gleam in lawmakers' eyes, right? Like this was Gavin Newsom hadn't done anything, Massachusetts hadn't done it. This was years before it was at all socially acceptable in America to have, in mainstream America, to have same-sex marriages. And so Babylon 5, so a little coding, a little bit explicit. They didn't have like an openly gay character because this was, again, the early 1990s on television, and they were always struggling to get to the next season. But they did more than anyone. They certainly did more than Star Trek in explicitness, right? Like Star Trek, I remember the fans went nuts when 2 Trill kissed and their bodies were the same gender because in the past they had been heterosexual lovers.
Although I will point out that Babylon 5 did this with background characters, but the main romantic and sexual relationship was between a human guy and an alien. So
a trans alien, right? She's a transhuman.
And what is acceptable then?
Yeah.
It's far more acceptable.
Was coded as trans?
I don't think so at all.
No? Even though she switched from Minbari to human?
Yeah. I don't think that most people think about that as a transition in the same way they think about that as a gender transition.
Sure.
I think that's acceptable because
codes everything, right? That's how it gets under the radar.
Yeah. But I think she was so coded as a heterosexual woman. That was the point. That was what made it acceptable.
Yeah. But remember the first episode, the pilot episode, she's gender non-binary in the pilot. They actually put like a fake chin on her and some other things to masculinize her face. And then they backed off of that in season 1. So go back and watch The Gathering. Delenn is non-binary.
Interesting. Well, and that's another part of this is that, okay, we had going from coded to explicit queerness when we were still doing, well, you're either gay and one of you is the man and one of you is the woman, but you're still gay and that's okay. And now we look at things like Foz Meadows' work where it's a bunch of non-binary people. Do we know who is doing what to whom? We do, actually, because it's a romance to a certain degree. And I actually read a story recently that was just sort of like, we don't know who is doing what to whom, blah. And I was like, you know what? This isn't actually a story. This is just like you trying to figure out what would be a cool evening of porn. So, but everybody's got to come to that stuff in their own way, even if it's your own group. You got to write your way into it. But yeah, I'm seeing a lot more non-binary, especially in the AO3 space, Archive of Our Own, which is where a lot of that fan fiction happens.
I want to bring up two very quick points. The first is the story that Cliff referenced, Leashed Steel. I wrote for a Clarion class. The exact review quote was, "I don't normally go for gay sadomasochistic military fiction, but in your case, I'll make an exception." I could not sell that story until I added the explicit BDSM that was not part of the first draft and then sold it to Circlet Press.
Which published erotica, science fiction, fantasy.
Erotic science fiction, fantasy, because the story didn't hold up without it. It was psychologically missing from the core of the story. But the other thing I wanted to raise, and you were bringing up with, we have to get to this in our own ways, is that there's a certain amount of what I think of as the Citizen Kane problem in a lot of now classic queer SF. If you show someone Citizen Kane now without giving them sort of the guided tour, they're likely to come away with, good grief, that movie was just full of cliches, wasn't it? Like, no, that movie is where they invented the cliches.
Sure.
Yep.
And to take one of my favorite novels, Ellen Kushner's Swords Point.
Yes.
Nowadays, that would be looked at, the male-male romance, and that would be looked on as quaint, perhaps a bit over-restrained, and it's like, no, you don't understand what that book meant at the... That book, when it was released, was...
groundbreaking.
Blowing huge numbers of doors open that we now never or hardly even realize were there.
Yeah.
Right. Like, they weren't advertising for fans of queer fantasy and found family and all that to advertise that book.
Right. There were no little number of pepper markers next to the reviews for how spicy is this book going to get.
Another often forgotten fantasy, explicitly queer fantasy, is the Door into Shadow, Door into Fire, Door by Diane Duane. The Door into series, which has off-camera sex, but explicit off-camera sex between two men. The two male leads are explicitly in a sexual relationship.
Yep. And I think, I don't know if that falls into her sort of adolescent YA sort of area, because Diane writes in that space a bunch, because the other person who wrote in that space and wrote sort of the door blowing open moment would have been Misty Lackey.
Oh yeah. Right.
Yeah. Vaniel is that. I'm sorry.
Valdemar.
That's the thing right there for the 80s.
Sure.
Absolutely. And there were other people and there were other people in that world who had relationships. Tarma and Ike Kethry were the lesbian codes in that, and they were great, but it was just like, that blew a lot of things open. And then we have now, which in the last 10 years has just confounded many, many people, would be this one.
Yeah. Talk about pronouns.
Yeah, I write specifically using they, them in nearly everything I write, just because I think that's where the culture is going. And I think that's probably where we're going to end up, just because it's easy. But I loved how hard this book was to read. And it wasn't easy for me because I'm queer. It was hard to read because that's not the expectations you have when you come to not only the book, but the language and the culture. These are all things that are being exploded at once. And so I was trying to read that first 5 pages going, I don't know enough about these people. And then finding out that I'm not going to know. And like I didn't realize that she actually gendered the not the main character, but the main character's main bot is kind of like, that's where you realize we don't have any idea what the gender is. They do eventually tell you exactly what there is in that person's pants, but it's so far into the story that I did not care at the time, and I completely overlooked it.
I think that's part of the point.
Yes.
Like, leave you, if you'll pardon the expression, leave you hanging until it's no longer of interest.
Yeah. Yeah, we have other things to care about. We care about the ways that they are tied into their culture. We care about the overall story that is happening. And yeah, it doesn't really matter. But I loved the idea that we just don't know.
Yeah. And but also there's been an uptick in trans writers writing trans characters, right? Like Charlie Jane Anders. There are others. I'm blanking. I will get there.
Yeah, there's been an uptick in straight people writing trans characters, and boy, there needs to. Can I just point out that if you're going to write the other, please go do some research.
Sure.
You know, maybe take a writing the other class. It's not necessarily what you think it is. You know, you can't just go, well, I'll just describe this person as brown and stick them in my story and it'll work. And no, it didn't. So yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that in the slush space, and I'm like, I'm glad you guys are working through that.
The thing is, if you describe someone as brown and then make no other differences, what you are saying implicitly is that the culture you are writing in has moved so differently from ours that it doesn't make a difference, and likely that background assumption is completely at odds with all of your foreground assumptions.
Sure.
You know, I think that was part of the brilliance of ancillary justice and things like that, because what that's saying by not telling you and not making, how should we put it, not making a big deal out of its mystery, not doing a fan dance, but just having a missing space, is saying, yep, in this culture you're inhabiting, that's a missing space.
Yep.
No one is talking about it because they don't care.
It's no longer an interesting thing.
Right.
About them.
It's the classic, you get to find out what's in my pants if I decide to take them off in front of you.
And I better be bleeding or I really like you.
Exactly.
So one of the things I read as a kid were the Shea Planet of Adventure series by Jack Vance. And I know how to pronounce the planet name because I got to ask Jack Vance how to do it. Because it's TSCHAI, something like that. Shea. Anyway, there's a species called the dare who are, I believe they had something like 18 biological sexes. And it's explicitly said that they had a society in which it was socially acceptable for only certain of their biological sexes to mate with certain others. So like if you were biological sex A, you could mate with B, C, but not D, right? You know, things like that.
Right.
And then it explicitly said, which I loved when I was like 12 and reading this, it explicitly said, therefore, the dare hide their biological sex from their fellow dare and keep it between themselves so that you only find out what sex your partner is once you're already naked, so that they could preserve the option of sleeping with whomever they wanted to. I mean, this was laid out in no uncertain terms. But they were aliens, right? They're already coded alien. They were one of the 3 species of really weird aliens. Four.
You just made me realize a story, another Vance story that is about transgenderism, transvestitism, and the ultimate authority of self-identification that I never thought of that way. The Moon Moth.
I haven't read that one. Tell me.
Oh, it is a brilliant mystery. It is a mystery story set on a planet where no one goes unmasked.
Yep.
And the masks they wear are explicit representations of personality, social status, artistic taste, etc. You would also, Cliff, you would also particularly like it because all dialogue between people is sung, accompanied on specific instruments based on the social relations between the speaker and the spoken to.
Oh, I gotta check this out.
Yes, it's called the Moon.
Yeah. When I read Perdido Street Station many years later, I was like, is he harkening back to this? Because that seemed to be very much like where China Mieville was coming from that.
I think so.
Yeah. So, yeah, both of those are interesting.
We've gotten a 3-minute warning from Bob.
Oh.
So this hour has flown by like a moth or a moon moth. And there are so many more examples. There's lots of more examples of trans writers. I mean, there's been an explosion of explicitly trans fiction, which is wonderful to see and wonderful to read. So check that out. Would either of you, okay, I'm going to ask you to do final, like, plug what you're working on, plug what's coming out, or plug something you like, and anything else you want to say as a closing remark on the subject. Kate just vanished, so maybe Steph?
I'll go first. The thing that I would, my forthcoming list is very short, so I will plug two things. One is About 5,750 Words by Samuel R. Delany, one of the best essays on the art of writing I have ever read.
And is it collected in one of his
It's
writing books?
collected in The Jewel-Hinged Jaw.
Wonderful.
I don't know which of the new, it may be collected elsewhere as well.
There's a current edition of that.
Yeah.
I have like the original blue one, but there's a current Wesleyan, I think.
There's a current Wesleyan edition.
Yeah.
And the other, an author whose name I should just float out there because he was also a brilliant coder of these things, and that's Thomas M. Dish.
Yes.
Who was not out as queer to the reading community for many years while he was out to the writing community. And much of his work deals with internal versus external representations. One entire book that I was, and this is what reminded me, is On Wings of Song.
I was hoping you were going to say that.
Which deals in large part with coding as queer, straight people who code as queer, queer people who code as queer, and just the general life around the opera, bel canto in particular.
Yes, and the burden of growing old in that milieu, which is a huge burden that most people don't talk about. And God, I love that book.
All right, Kate.
Okay, so previous things. I have been in Veterans, number 16 of Boundary Shot Quarterly. And in there, in case you feel like being topical about weapon systems, I have an essay in there about the when Raytheon bought the red carpet at the Hugos and everyone went nuts. Yeah, there's an essay in there about that.
Nice.
It was fun.
I need a link.
Okay, there. And I am also, in the middle of reading my submissions for the dinosaur anthology called, I think it's And Space Dinosaurs, or no, Because Space Dinosaurs. And
that's a brilliant title.
Thank you, because I'm hoping it's going to lead into Because Space Dinosaurs, TOO.
Show us I got a little bit of a Stegosaurus on your shirt there.
Oh, I am the thesaurus today.
Oh, I love it.
You're not really a saurus, you are the saurus.
The saurus. So we got to do finger guns. So that's kind of where I'm going. We are looking at self-publishing, and I'm looking at probably around December that coming out.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's so awesome. I'm so glad you're doing that. There need to be more dinosaurs in science fiction and fantasy. There just do.
And I was thinking, I'm not going to put anything of mine in there. And I'm like, oh, yes, I am. So
is it those dinosaurs in the mess hall? Because I love the dinosaurs in the mess hall.
It is not the dinosaurs in the mess hall, but God, I love that. I got to get back to writing that. That is so much fun. The dinosaur space armies that I'm looking for. Yeah.
All righty. Well, at this point, we're going to look around until Bob gets here. He's going to appear somewhere. I don't know.
He's adjusting his
Hello,
rainbow
Bob.
suspenders. There he is.
There you go.
Hey, I exist.
Yay.
So it's been a very interesting session. Oh, let me turn my camera back around. Hey, it was fun watching. I just got to say, thank you guys. It has been very interesting. I still go back to what Steph did before the show, and that was we had a more understanding discussion of what coding was, and now I know something I didn't know then, and that
Our
is
work
that
here is
Bugs
done.
Bunny
It's just
is a
one
gay
viewer.
icon.
Yes.
I didn't know that. I just it was kind of humorous. I mean, I still poke fun at the congressmen who grew up watching Bugs Bunny and are really worried about drag shows.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's like, good God, guys, you know, I mean, drag. What was that Tony Curtis movie?
Some Like It Hot?
Some Like It Hot. You know, I mean, this is not new in Hollywood. It's just like, but somehow since Newt Gingrich took power, it has been a long, drawn out, continuous assault on anything that is not heterosexuality and whiteness all rolled into one masculine body. Now, I understand that I do epitomize that, but
Yet you're wearing rainbow suspenders, as Kate noted.
hey, as I said, I always had been since I've worn suspenders. I've had one, two, three, or several sets of rainbow suspenders, but I also have carpenter's measuring suspenders in yellow and black. I even have a pair of camo suspenders.
But you can never find them.
They're out in the yard somewhere. But just the total awareness or lack of awareness, I think, sometimes, as to some of us out here who are just totally ignorant about.
Steph said they were losing signal. So
Okay.
Oh, I just don't think he likes my rainbow suspenders myself. But
they're awesome. They remind me of Robin Williams.
Yeah, he showed up at the time that Cliff gave him to show up, and he really, truly, it was a wonderful, because when I first saw the concept of coded gayness, I just assumed we were talking about Paul Lynde.
I wish.
Well, that was the first example that showed up in my brain.
You know, one thing we haven't mentioned is, speaking of coded gayness, the large number of gay robots in science fiction, like C-3PO, who was not the first.
Don't be messing with C-3PO.
Oh, he's so gay.
Darth Vader. I mean, you know when that show lost me? Star Wars really lost me. It's when they said Darth Vader built C-3PO.
Oh, well.
For his mother. You know, it was like, at that point, okay, guys, you're just making shit up. You're not writing.
So it's a galaxy of like 20 people, really, you know.
Yeah. Well, we need a robot. Darth Vader, would you mind building a robot?
Right.
So, well, Kate, it is so wonderful. Steph says,
There is only one
Oh.
woman in the Star Wars universe at the same time, and only one person who builds robots at the time.
Yep.
okay.
And that woman dies of sadness because medicine is so advanced.
Right. Yes, exactly.
I just know that it's been a great and informative show and pre-show, and thank you all for coming and doing it. And on that note,
Thank you, live studio audience.
say again.
Thanking the live studio audience who commented over and over. And I'm sorry I didn't get to respond to everybody's wonderful comments, but we've had lots of really insightful comments.
Oh, but just a second on that one that Andrew wrote, gay or British. That was interestingly enough, early on when we were having our pregame talk, I had asked Steph about that, and I said, no, I mean, I just assumed what you guys were calling coded was just French. And, you know,
that.
Yes.
a culture that allowed more feminine displays than were allowed in traditional American culture. And he got into that, got good, confused, and thoughtful look, and pointed out that for that to really work, there needed to be a hint of accent, so you knew you were dealing with a European culture as opposed to a gay culture. And actually, when I thought about it, that made a lot of sense. So does that work for you there, Andrew? I got the answer from the answer came up prior to you asking the question. But anyway, I have no idea what I'm talking about. So I'm going to say thank you all for being here. And